people, their emotional arousal is significantly greater when they're being looked at than when they're not being looked at. They're not asked to guess consciously. It's an unconscious response. This has now been repeated many, many times. Of course, looking at people through closed-circuit television is a common thing in the modern world. It's the basis of the surveillance industry, which is one of the big growth areas at the moment of the economy. There's so much concern with security. There are now thousands of people who are paid to watch others through closed-circuit television all day long. I've interviewed a lot of security officers, as well as private detectives and surveillance personnel in other areas. Most of them are very convinced that people can tell when they're being looked at, even through closed-circuit television. Some store detectives in London, for example, told me that if they watch shoplifters particularly intensively when they're stealing things, for example, they were watching a couple of women stealing shoes, putting them in a bag, the women suddenly started looking really shifty, looked around for the hidden camera, and put the shoes back and left the store. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that this really works through closed-circuit television. This phenomenon is also well known in the military. Special forces, at least in Britain, are trained if you're creeping up behind someone to stab them in the back, you don't stare at their back. Otherwise, they'll turn around, see you, and shoot you first. And private detectives, if any of you have been on a private detective training course, probably you haven't, but if you had, one of the first things you learn if you're going to follow somebody is not to stare at their back, because the chances are they'll turn around, meet your eyes, and then your cover's blown. So there's a lot of practical information about this. This also works with animals. A lot of people have found that they can affect animals by staring at them. For example, a lot of people find they can wake their dogs or cats by looking at them, or they can be affected by the looks of animals. Wildlife photographers and hunters have a lot of experience of looking at animals when they don't want the animal to know they're there. They too are convinced that animals can tell when they're being looked at. Not all animals, not all the time, but much more than you'd expect by chance. So I think this phenomenon is very widespread. And I think this theory of vision I've put forward that involves a two-way process applies to animals as well as people. And in fact, if there's anything in this, if there's a potentiality for telling when you're being looked at, for an animal it would obviously be of great interest to know when they're being looked at by predators. If prey animals could tell when they're being looked at and escape, this would obviously be of survival value and favored by natural selection. So I think this is a phenomenon that may be extremely deeply rooted in our biological nature and may go back a long way in biological history. Well, there's also a huge amount of folklore about this phenomenon. And I think it's possibly the fact there's so much folklore about it which has led skeptics to be so skeptical about it, precisely because so many people believe in it. They think there must be something wrong with it. And in countries like Greece, Turkey, the Arab world, India, it's widely believed that you can affect people by looking at them. You can affect them for good or for bad. Indians will often travel hundreds of miles for the darshan, the look of a holy man or woman. And also in all these countries, the people greatly fear the evil eye, which is essentially the eye of envy. If you look at somebody enviously, it's believed to have a negative effect on the person or the thing that's looked at. It's extremely widespread belief. Now, I don't know whether in fact it has a negative effect or not, but I do think that you can have an effect by looking at people. They can detect the look. Whether the quality of the look, the emotion involved, has a specific effect, I don't know. There's been no research at all on that as far as I know. But it's an interesting fact that in countries where there's a widespread belief in the evil eye, it is still very common. In Greece, for example, in modern Greece, almost everybody believes in the evil eye, although most educated people pretend not to, at least in public. I carried out a survey there with the help of a research assistant in Athens with the appropriate name of Socrates, who interviewed a lot of people in Athens for me about this and in Greece. And he found almost everyone believes in it, although many say they don't. A typical split attitude is from this young man, scientifically educated in Athens, who said, "I don't believe in the evil eye, but I fear it. When I'm on my motorcycle and see someone who I think is in some way admiring me, I immediately pray to the Virgin Mary, in whom I don't believe either, except at the moment of fear." Well, that's very typical of the sort of attitude you find in many parts of the world about these phenomena among educated people. And it's somewhat similar to the attitude you find to telepathy among educated people in America and in Europe, where most people have had experiences that seem telepathic or of the sense of being stared at, and yet feel that they ought to deny them out of some vague loyalty to some kind of scientific principles. Actually, most of these things have never been examined scientifically, and so the prejudice against them is not scientific. It's, in my opinion, unscientific. What really counts is evidence. Well, this is one range of phenomena that suggest the existence of the extended mind. There's a whole other range of phenomena connected with telepathy, which I think, like the sense of being stared at, are rooted in our biological nature. In my previous book, which is called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home and Other Unexplained Powers of Animals, I look at a whole range of unexplained powers in animals, and I think that telepathy, which literally means feeling at a distance, tele as in telephone, television means distant, pathy means feeling as in empathy, sympathy, telepathy means feeling at a distance. I think this is a normal means of communication between members of animal groups. Some animal groups, like flocks of birds and schools of fish, behave as if there's a field of the whole group, and I think they're best modeled. The best computer models treat them as field phenomena, the most up-to-date computer models. Some of the early models, like Craig Reynolds Boyd's, are based on nearest neighbor effects, looking at nearby ones and reacting by simple rules to neighbors, but they're biologically naive. These movements happen much too fast to be explained by just direct visual or other sensory interactions between neighbors. And the most up-to-date and interesting models treat them as field phenomena. And I think they are field phenomena. I think packs of wolves, herds of animals, as well as schools of fish, flocks of birds, have fields of the whole group that link them together. I don't have time, as I said, to go into this morphic field theory. But I'll just say enough about it to show how I think it could lead to a prediction of telepathy. If the members of the group go apart, if beyond the range of the senses, the field of the whole group, I think, still connects them. So the field, as it were, stretches like an invisible elastic band between them. So a change in one can affect the others. This is analogous to quantum non-locality, where particles that have been part of the same system, when separated, retain a non-local or non-separable or entangled connection, so a change in one can affect the others. I'm not saying it's the same as quantum non-locality, although it may be a manifestation of that principle at a macroscopic level. This is an open question which I've discussed with a number of quantum physicists, and you can't say whether what I call morphic fields are actually these quantum effects at a higher level or not. No one knows enough about the quantum effects to say that at present, but it's possible. It's certainly analogous. And one has to remember that when quantum non-locality first came into focus, Einstein was one of the first to bring it into focus. He did so because he so disliked it. He thought that if quantum theory was right, there would be what he called a spooky action at a distance between particles. And he thought that was so unlikely that quantum theory must be wrong. Well, experiments show that Einstein was wrong. Quantum non-locality was right. And this is, of course, now the basis of a lot of research with a view to quantum computing. Quantum teleportation and these phenomena are all based on quantum non-locality, and so is quantum encrypting. Well, I think that members of animal groups retain this connection at a distance, and I've mostly done research with animals that we know best, domestic animals like dogs and cats. And many people who keep dogs and cats have found that their animals seem to pick up their thoughts and intentions. I've collected a huge database of case studies. Normally, scientists don't consider people's experience. They reject it as anecdotal. Charles Darwin based practically all his research on anecdotal reports. And actually, I think anecdotes, experiences, are the basis for science, the starting point. When you get hundreds of stories where people say they've seen the same kind of thing, at least it forms a natural history of what people believe is happening. And I have a huge database now classified into various categories. One of the common things people notice with animals, dogs and cats, is that they seem to anticipate the arrival of a member of the household. This is the eponymous theme of my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. In this case, the dogs or cats go and wait at a door or window when a member of the household's on the way home. And often the people at home say, oh, so-and-so must be coming home because the dog's at the door. Now, if it only happens a minute or two beforehand, no one thinks this strange. It could be hearing the crunch of car wheels on the gravel, familiar footsteps in the street. If it's at a routine time, no one thinks it's strange. It could be a biological clock. But many people have noticed it happens at non-routine times and at least 10 minutes in advance when the person is far away. This is, in fact, quite a common phenomenon. We've done surveys of this in Britain and in America. And about 50%, these are random household surveys, about 50% of dog owners say that their dogs anticipate the arrival of a member of the family. Cats do it less. For some reason, the British cats do it less than the Californian cats. But even in Los Angeles, the cats don't do it as much as dogs. How did that happen? I think I can make that stop happening. Right. Oh, it's overdone it now. Well, we've got the problem of too many people with too many controls here. No, we need the
Someone might be leaning on a light switch.
They are, I think, yes. Okay, let me go on. This phenomenon of dogs knowing when their owners are coming home is often explained. Well, it's not usually thought about. Most dog owners take it for granted. But skeptics say, not unreasonably, well, how do you know it's not habit? How do you know it's not just hearing familiar sounds? How do you know they're not picking it up from people at home? To answer those questions, we need to do specific experiments. And I've now done more than 200 videotaped trials. We videotape the place where the animal waits continuously. We have people come home at randomly chosen times from at least 5 miles away. They're paged on a pager at times they don't know in advance. No one at home knows when they're coming, and often there is no one at home when we do the experiments. And they travel in unfamiliar vehicles, like taxis. Well, in those experiments, the results are very clear. The dogs still know when people are coming home, and they start waiting when the person forms the intention to come home, usually before they've even got into the vehicle. I have a film of this, which I'm not going to show today because there isn't time, but I'll just show the data summarized from these trials. This is from averages from a series of trials with long, medium, and short return periods. Long, medium, and short. These are 10-minute intervals after the person went out. And these are the number of seconds the dog spends at the window while they're away from home in each 10-minute period. The filled circles represent the first 10 minutes of the homeward journey when they're in the car. We chop off the last 5 to 10 minutes of the journey just in case the dog could have heard them when they're nearing home. So this is only the first 10 minutes of the homeward journey. As you see, the dogs are at the window by far the most, highly significantly so, when people are on the way home. And they start waiting at the window in the 10-minute period, and sometimes even before that, before the people come home. And that's before they get into the car, but after they've formed the intention to come. They do visit the window to a limited extent when people aren't coming home. On the films, it's easy to see why. They're usually barking at passing cats or looking at things going on outside. And there are, in the best dog that we've studied, the one that does it most routinely, intensively, when they're stealing things. For example, they're watching a couple of women stealing shoes, putting them in a bag. The women suddenly started looking really shifty, looked around for the hidden camera, and put the shoes back and left the store. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that this really works through closed-circuit television. This phenomenon is also well known in the military. Special forces, at least in Britain, are trained if you're creeping up behind someone to stab them in the back, you don't stare at their back. Otherwise, they'll turn around, see you, and shoot you first. And private detectives, one thing in the modern world, is the basis of the surveillance industry, which is one of the big growth areas at the moment of the economy. There's so much concern with security. There are now thousands of people who are paid to watch others through closed-circuit television all day long. I've interviewed a lot of security officers, as well as private detectives and surveillance personnel in other areas. Most of them are very convinced that people can tell when they're being looked at, even through closed-circuit television. Some store detectives in London, for example, told me that if they watch shoplifters, particularly, and people, their emotional arousal is significantly greater when they're being looked at than when they're not being looked at. They're not asked to guess consciously. It's an unconscious response. This has now been repeated many, many times. Of course, looking at people through closed-circuit television is a common